On July 18, 2020, what should have been a simple, ordinary evening in rural Florida turned into a nightmare of unimaginable violence. A young mother, radiant and full of life, walked into her children's father's driveway to pick them up, something countless parents do every day. But in the span of seconds, that routine turned deadly. Before she could even process what was happening, she was gunned down in cold blood, leaving 2 children without their mother and a family shattered forever. Was born on June 10, 1989, in Stuart, Florida. From the very beginning, she was described as lively, bright, and filled with an energy that couldn't be contained. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, but more than anything, she was a mother. Her 2 young children, Dallas and Carter, were the center of her world. She poured every ounce of love she had into them, celebrating their milestones, encouraging their growth, and shaping their childhoods with joy. Her role as a mother wasn't just something she did, it was who she was. Brittany's personality radiated warmth. She had a laugh that carried across a room, a sense of humor that could brighten even the darkest days, and a sense of adventure that kept her spirit alive. She traveled often, from the Caribbean to Greece, and loved exploring the world. She had earned her associate degree at Tallahassee Community College and was preparing to further her studies at Barton College. She had her eyes on a future filled with possibilities for herself and her children. But like many young mothers, Brittany's life was not without challenges. She had been in a relationship with Edward June Harris Jr., the father of her 2 children. What had once been a bond became fractured over time, marred by conflict and tension. Their relationship grew toxic, and Brittany's efforts to separate herself and focus on her children only seemed to make Harris more controlling. He was a convicted felon with a history of violent behavior, and those close to Brittany worried about his temper. Despite this, she continued to co-parent, ensuring her children had access to both parents while trying to keep peace in a difficult situation. On July 18, 2020, Brittany went to Harris's home to pick up her children. It was a Saturday evening, and what should have been routine, placing her babies into the car and bringing them home, turned into the most horrific night imaginable. Brittany had her 1-year-old daughter in her arms and her young son strapped into his car seat when Harris appeared with a rifle. The sound of his voice, the sudden presence of the weapon, and the confusion of the moment left Brittany stunned. She reportedly screamed, "What are you doing?" in shock, unable to believe what was about to happen. Without warning, Harris pulled the trigger. The shots echoed through the night as Brittany was struck 3 times, 2 shots to the head and 1 through her eye. The violence was immediate and devastating. Brittany collapsed in the driveway, still holding her child just moments before. Her daughter was later found inside the home covered in blood but miraculously unharmed. The brutality of Harris's actions, murdering the mother of his own children in front of them, shook the community to its core. Brittany hadn't come alone that night. A close friend, Heather Helms, was with her, sitting in the passenger seat of the car. When the gunfire erupted, Heather sprang into action. She climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the car into gear, and drove away desperate to escape the nightmare that had just unfolded. Meanwhile, Harris fled in his green Ford Explorer. Police were called immediately, and the search began. He led law enforcement on a high-speed chase, driving recklessly and reaching speeds of nearly 100 miles per hour. The pursuit ended when deputies forced him off the road, and Harris finally surrendered. It was the conclusion of his rampage, but for Brittany's loved ones, the true nightmare had only just begun. The crime scene left behind was chilling. Investigators found Brittany lying lifeless in the driveway, the evidence of her final moments painting a brutal picture. Her daughter was discovered inside, smeared in her mother's blood. Even hardened deputies were shaken by the sheer cruelty of it. This wasn't just a murder. It was a calculated act of domestic violence carried out with no regard for the innocence of the children caught in the middle. The trial that followed pulled the curtain back on the toxic relationship between Brittany and Harris. Testimonies revealed his controlling nature, his violent past, and the ways he tried to maintain dominance even as their relationship collapsed. Prosecutors argued that the murder was premeditated, that Harris had decided Brittany would not be allowed to move on, to raise her children without him, or to build the future she was so determined to create. In December 2022, Harris stood before a jury. The deliberations lasted only 15 minutes before they returned with a guilty verdict for first-degree premeditated murder, along with charges of child neglect, fleeing and eluding, and unlawful possession of a firearm. The swiftness of the decision reflected just how clear the case was. Harris was sentenced to life in prison, with an additional 45 years for the other crimes. He will never walk free again. Inside the courtroom, emotions overflowed. Brittany's family broke down as they delivered their victim impact statements, describing the immeasurable void left by her death. Tears, Anger and heartbreak filled the room, and at moments tension spilled over between families. For them, justice had been served, but no sentence could ever restore Brittany's laughter, her energy, or the love she carried for her children. Her legacy is remembered not in the brutality of her death, but in the beauty of her life. She was a mother who lived for her children, a friend who filled lives with light, a young woman with dreams still unfolding. She loved fiercely, and her story stands now as a heartbreaking reminder of the dangers of domestic violence, how quickly it can erupt, and how devastating its impact can be. For her children, their mother's memory will live on in the stories told about her kindness, her strength, and her love. For her community, the loss of Brittany Steier is a wound that will never fully heal, but her spirit continues to inspire awareness and action in the fight to prevent such tragedies from happening again. Brittany Steier was more than a headline. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend, and a woman who loved fiercely and lived fully. Her life was stolen in an act of senseless violence, but her memory remains in the hearts of all who loved her. In June of 1997, a young Michigan mother set out on what should have been a simple date with a friend. She never came home. Just weeks later, her body was discovered in a lake, chained and weighted, still wearing the blindfold that had been tied over her eyes. She was only 19 years old, and she left behind a 1-year-old daughter who would vanish as well. This is the haunting story of Rachael Timmerman, a young woman who tried to stand up for herself and paid the ultimate price. Rachael was born in 1978 and grew up in Cedar Springs, Michigan. She was described as a bright, sweet-natured girl who loved her family and found her greatest joy in her daughter Shannon, who was born when Rachael was only 18. Though young, Rachael embraced motherhood. Friends recalled how devoted she was to Shannon, how she doted on her, and how she worked hard to build a stable life for herself and her baby. She was the kind of girl who laughed easily, who had a strong will, and who believed in doing what was right, even when it put her at risk. That risk began months earlier when Rachael accused a man named Marvin Gabriel of luring her to a remote cabin where she said she was beaten and raped. It was a terrifying ordeal, but Rachael didn't keep it hidden. She pressed charges, and Gabriel was due to face trial. It was an extraordinary act of courage for a teenager to go up against a man with a reputation for volatility and violence. But Gabriel was not the kind of man to face consequences without striking back. On June 3, 1997, Rachael told her father she had a date that evening. The man picking her up was someone she described as a friend, and she promised she would be home later that night. She never returned. 2 days later, hikers in Oxford Lake in Newaygo County made a horrific discovery. In shallow water, they found the body of a young woman. Her wrists and ankles were bound in chains, and she was padlocked to cinder blocks to keep her submerged. A blindfold was still tied over her eyes. The victim was identified as Rachael Timmerman. She had been murdered just days before she was scheduled to testify against Marvin Gabriel. Rachael's death was devastating, but the horror deepened with another realization. Her baby daughter Shannon was missing. Shannon had last been seen with Rachael before she disappeared, and though her body has never been found, investigators believe she was also killed. The child was only 11 months old. To this day, Shannon Timmerman's fate remains one of the most heartbreaking, unanswered questions connected to the case. The investigation quickly focused on Marvin Gabriel. He had a long history of violence, fraud, and manipulation. He was known for using multiple aliases, drifting from state to state, and evading accountability wherever he went. Witnesses came forward to say that Gabriel had threatened Rachael after she pressed charges, warning her that she would not live to testify. Evidence tied him to the lake where Rachael's body was found, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance left little doubt about who was responsible. In 2002, Gabriel was convicted in federal court for Rachael's murder. Because the crime had taken place on federal land, the lake was within the jurisdiction of the Manistee National Forest. Prosecutors were able to seek the death penalty. He became the first person in Michigan in decades to be sentenced to death, even though the state itself had abolished capital punishment in the 19th century. His case was prosecuted federally, and his death sentence sparked years of appeals. But for Rachael's family, the trial was never enough to heal the wound. Her parents had lost a daughter in the most brutal way imaginable, and her baby granddaughter had simply vanished. Rachael's courage in accusing Gabriel had set this chain of events in motion, but the cost was almost unimaginable. The case remains one of Michigan's most haunting true crimes, the murder of a young mother silenced before she could testify, and the disappearance of her infant child who was never found. Over the years, Gabriel has remained on death row, showing little remorse and often lashing out in court with bizarre outbursts. His case is remembered not only for its brutality but also for its rarity. a Michigan death penalty sentence carried out through federal law. But the true heart of the story isn't in the legal details. It lies in the life of Rachael Timmerman, a young mother who wanted nothing more than to protect her daughter and seek justice, who was robbed of her future, and whose family was robbed of both her and Shannon. Rachael's story is a reminder of how dangerous it can be to stand up against someone willing to use violence to silence the truth. It is also a reminder of how much strength it takes to do what Rachael did, to face her attacker in court, knowing the risks. Her bravery cost her everything, but it also ensured that her killer would never harm another young woman. The memory of Rachael and Shannon Timmerman lives on in her family, in the community that grieved for them, and in the enduring reminder of how fragile life is when confronted with violence. Rachael's story is one of heartbreak, but also of courage. The courage of a 19-year-old mother who tried to fight for justice, even when the odds were stacked against her. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Until next time, take care and be kind.